Hello, everyone. I'm recording this over the summer after having jaw surgery, so if my voice sounds a little different or a little silly, I'm doing my best. My mouth isn't moving quite the way I'm used to, so I will do my best to articulate, but cut me some slack here. Um, all right. The next book you are going to read is called Lord of the Flies. And so before you actually jumped into this very famous novel, um, almost everybody has read it at one point during their school career. And if they haven't, they certainly know about it and know the story. And before you jump in, we wanted to give you just a little bit of background information so you know kind of what William Golding, the author, was thinking as he wrote the story. Okay, the author is William Golding. Um, he was born in 1911 in England. His dad was a teacher. His mom was a homemaker, but was really involved in getting women's rights, the right for women to vote in England. And his childhood was happy and uneventful. They had some maids in their house, and he would always sneak down and borrow their romance novels. And when he wasn't reading romance novels, he would read classics like the Odyssey, and he absolutely loved losing himself in books. Um, and he wasn't much of a student. He spent most of his days, by his recollection, kind of staring out the window, making up stories in his head rather than listening in school. When he went off to college, he started out by majoring in anthropology and archaeology. And it took him a couple years to realize what he really, really loved was literature. And he switched his major over to literature. And actually, while he was in college, his first love was poetry. And he actually published a book of poems while he was in college. And an interviewer later on in his life said, well, tell me about that book of poems. And he says something about, I know it's still out there somewhere, but honestly, I'd rather forget it. And later in his life, he kind of said, I write prose because I can't write poetry. He always adored poetry, but he always felt like he wasn't good enough to write poetry. Um, After college, he worked at a small London theater company as an actor, as a writer, as a producer. But then he decided, I want to settle down. And he got married, and he applied to be a teacher at a private boys' school, and he was accepted. But before he could go off and begin his teaching career, World War II broke out. And he decided that he was going to join the Navy. And when we talk about him participating in World War II, he really was in the middle of everything. He was at D-Day. He took part in the sinking of the Bismarck. He also, at one point, he was stranded for 3 days in a lifeboat in the English Channel. So he saw an awful lot of action during World War II, and this is a huge component of how he came to view human beings is through his experiences in the war. And I'll talk more about that later, but the fact that he was in the war is hugely influential in all of his works. After the war, the school where he had applied and gotten a job was nice enough to keep the job for him, so he went back and he began teaching. He taught English and he taught philosophy, and he began to write. And he took his experiences from the war, and in addition to the experiences that he had as a teacher viewing kids. And that's kind of where Lord of Flies started, taking what he learned in the war and taking what he saw out on the playing fields and the quads at the school, and kind of putting them together. During his life, he published about 20 works of literature, but none of them are as famous as Lord of the Flies, but also very well received and very interesting, and again explore some of the same themes as Lord of the Flies. He earned many honors for his work. He was eventually knighted by Queen Elizabeth, and he also earned the Nobel Prize for his whole body of work, not for one particular book, but for his body of work. And then he died in 1993. Okay, so let's get into Lord of the Flies specifically. What's really interesting about Lord of the Flies is Coral Island, which is a book about three boys who are shipwrecked on an island. Um, uh, and then have a wonderful time. This is kind of a magical place where they get to, be independent, and they're great friends, and have these wonderful adventures. Coral Island, this book, this happy book, was one of his favorite books as a child. And so what he did for Lord of the Flies was he took the concept of Coral Island, and then he said, all right, now, what I know from being in the war and from watching kids at school, I'm going to make this book a little bit more realistic and a little less happy. So that's kind of fun to think about. I mean, think about one of your very favorite books growing up, and think what would happen if you kind of turned it on its head, made it more realistic, turned a comic idea into a tragic idea, made something that was happy into something horrific. And that's exactly what he did here. He sent it off to 25 publishers, and he got 21 rejection notices before the 22nd publishing company finally said, all right, we'll publish a few copies of these. And the reviewers kind of said, it's okay, it's a little too dark, we don't really like it. But when the public started to read it, they ate it up. They loved it. And pretty soon, high school English teachers started having kids read it. And it was a huge success, especially at first it was published in England, and then when it came over to America, Americans really felt like this was an interesting and powerful novel. And it's really been very influential in other works. So think about Survivor and reality TV. Think about Lost, where people are stranded on an island. That you can see echoes of the themes of Lord of the Flies and even the general concept throughout literature even today. Simpsons actually did a spoof on Lord of the Flies. I think South Park did too. So, what was Golding thinking when he was writing Lord of the Flies? I think this quote is really telling. This was during an interview. And he said, I learned during World War II just how brutal people can be to each other. Not just Germans or Japanese, but everyone. And I think that's really important. Also in that interview, what he says, and I do think it's important. He says, I know everybody's going to take this the wrong way, but he said, you know what, it's so easy for us to think, okay, the Allies are the good guys. There's something fundamentally different about the Nazis. They're bad, they're evil. And he said, but human beings are human beings. And he has this really interesting quote. He says, I wouldn't like this to be misunderstood, as I'm sure it would be, but if you take the people out of the concentration camps and make concentration camp guards of them, the situation would not be altered material. Can you see what I'm talking about? And what he's saying is that any human being who is put in a position of power is going to take advantage of it and is going to act in an evil way. It's not something that's fundamental to Nazis or fundamental to bad people. He says it's part of human nature in general. And so he had this idea after he fought in the war, but then he went out into the quads at school, and he saw the kids being mean to each other, and he saw the kids forming cliques and groups, and he realized that this kind of evil nature began happening really early. And the thing is he wasn't the very first person to have this idea. Philosophers from the beginning, from years and years ago, there are some philosophers who say, look, human beings are generally good, and aspects of society cause them to turn bad. And then there are some philosophers who say human beings are innately evil, and the reason we have have to have rules, or else our evil nature gets the better of us, and our society begins to fall apart. And so rules are fundamental and necessary to human behavior. So that's kind of an interesting thing for you to think about. Do you believe that human beings will do the right thing without rules? Or do you think human beings need rules in order to do the right thing? And then finally, he wrote a book called The Inheritors after World War II, and it's basically about how the Homo sapiens come and basically overtake the Neanderthals, and we always have kind of in our history and in our thinking we've always said, oh well, the Neanderthals, they just weren't quite smart enough. They just weren't, Homo sapiens were so much smarter. That's why the Neanderthals died out. Well, Golding posits the Homo sapiens are basically more violent, and that's why the Neanderthals died out. And so ultimately, where our whole society is based on, from primitive people, the the violence, and that's why we're here today, and why the Neanderthal race is that we are built on violence. So I think my favorite part about this Nobel Prize Committee um, um, little quote here is this idea that Lord of the Flies has a mythic quality. There's something about it that's almost like a fable or a myth, because it teaches us so fundamentally about human nature, and it illuminates the human condition in the world today. And so it seems like it's a boy stranded in the middle of nowhere on an island. Well, it seems kind of silly, but ultimately what we learn about human nature from this book is pretty unbelievable. Something to think about, Lord of the Flies is an allegory. Remember, allegory from last year, Animal Farm was an allegory for the Russian Revolution. An allegory is basically two stories for the price of one. We have our story, our actual literal story, and then we have an underlying meaning that's much deeper and is, when Old Major is giving the speech about animalism, we're supposed to be thinking about that's an allegory for Lenin giving the speech to the peasants in the Russian right before the Russian Revolution and getting them worked up. Lord of the Flies is actually a more complex allegory, because instead of some specific historical event, it's actually saying this little tiny island is a microcosm for the whole world, and each character on this little tiny island represents people in our real world. Something to look out for throughout Lord of the Flies. We have this theory of archetypes. Carl Jung was a psychologist, and basically what he says is throughout literature, from every single culture, we always see the same characters over and over. We see the hero. Think about religious works, right? Whether it's Jesus, whether it's Buddha, and then whether it's Luke Skywalker, whether it's Harry Potter, this hero is a fundamental figure in literature from all over the world. And William Golding really takes advantage of this idea of archetypes. So I have a picture here of one of the boys. This is from the movie, that this boy is the character of Piggy. And even from the physicality, the physical appearance of him, you probably know what his archetype is here. There's another psychologist that's important to kind of think about as you read Lord of the Flies, and that's Sigmund Freud. You've probably heard of him before. And one of his main theories was the theory of the id, the ego, and the superego. And he said that every human being has these three parts, and they kind of wrestle each other to see which one's going to gain dominance. So which one is which? You see from the picture here, you can take a look. Super ego, no, it's not right, you can't do this. Ego, I need to do a little bit of planning. And the id is, I want it now. So here's another example of that. The id, it seeks pleasure to avoid pain. That's to avoid pain. That's, your self-centered bit. One who says, I'm going to eat the whole cake now so nobody else gets it, so I get to enjoy all of it, and I am not going to think about the fact that my little brother wants some. The ego, wants pleasure, but doesn't but actually thinks about the consequences. It's not going to do things that are evil. And then you have the superego, and that's kind of, that's the parent. That's the one that makes us moral and civilized and says, I'm not even going to touch the cake until my little brother comes home so that we can split it evenly and share it. So these three parts, another way to think about it is the little angel and devil sitting on our shoulder, and our head in the middle. So our head is the ego trying to decide between the two. We got our angel, the id, our angel, the superego, and the devil, which is the id. And we actually see in Lord of the Flies characters who epitomize each of these components of the human mind. So enjoy the book.